Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. We are so excited that you are joining us for the show today. This podcast aims to explore a biblical life view in a conversational tone. Let's join our host and founder of Servants of Grace, Dave Jenkins, for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this podcast. And with me today, I have Michael. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. Can you please tell us a little bit about your life, marriage, ministry, and some of the current ministry projects that you're working on?
Sure. Yeah, I live in Roanoke, Virginia with my wife, Kelly, and our two sons. I'm currently about 1 year into starting Blue Ridge Christian Counseling, which is a biblical counseling center here in the Valley. We're officially a ministry of the Presbyterian Church in America, but we're serving faithful believers of all denominations, and doing training ministry, strengthening the one another care in churches, and also doing counseling. That's the main project that's occupying most of my time right now. Like I said, we're about to come up on a 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, how's it going there at 1 year so far?
It's been great. The reception's been really warm. Churches have sensed the need, and especially in some of the areas a little farther from Roanoke. We have a satellite office a little ways out. Some of the more rural areas have been a bit underserved. There have been fewer people providing counseling, and so we feel we've been able to try to meet a need.
That's awesome. Praise God. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, After an Affair, Pursuing Restoration, why you wrote it, and how it's being received?
Sure. There was maybe a set of months several years ago when I was working with a lot of people, several men in particular, who were trying to restore their marriages, trying to come back to the Lord after straying away through an affair. And I found myself struggling to know what to offer them and struggling to find resources that I felt were accessible and that I could feel confident in. And so I started just kind of writing notes down myself, and I ended up thinking, okay, I'm going to make a little workbook, and I'm just going to give it to people, and there's no reason to ever publish this. It'll just be something they can work on outside of the session, kind of help with the educational component. There are just certain insights that I felt most of the people I was working with needed to get to at some point. And so kind of fast forward from me working on that for a while, I ran into someone who worked for a publisher and wanted to see it come to print as part of the devotional series, which was actually really exciting because I started thinking mostly in terms of how do I help a person restore their marriage, but making it a devotional made it decidedly more of a spiritually focused resource. I'd certainly hoped that it would be spiritually grounded in what I was already doing and when I was already working on it, but this really gave it a much more of a depth. And so I was really excited about the project having that component. And I also found that it really helped kind of thread the needle reach people where they were willing to be reached. What I've often found is that when, again, particularly I'm working with men, when they come clean and they're trying to patch things up, when I start to ask them, how did we end up here? How did this happen? There's often a really simplistic understanding of what happened. And it's, it says the right words, but there's not a depth there. It's, I was straying from the Lord. I wasn't reading my Bible. I wasn't doing well spiritually. And then this is what happened. And so they say, now everything's going to be different. Now I'm having devotions. Now I'm going to church. Now I'm listening to sermons in the car. All good things. But I would try to persuade them that there was a little bit more that needed to happen. There needed to be a greater understanding of where they've gone off course, so they can understand how to prevent that in the future and how to start to speak to the impact that it's had on their spouse. I often met resistance as I would try to help do something that I felt was more that would be more of long-term good. So that where I felt like I actually could meet people where they were willing to have devotions. And so I said, well, okay, let's have these devotions and let's grow more sensitive in what God would have you gain insight into in your own heart, and also in the impact of the affair on the other person.
And how do people respond? How do people respond to that?
It's been a pretty good reception so far. I've given it to a couple people I'm working with in counseling, and they found it helpful. And I found a lot of pastors say that they'd love to keep a couple of them on hand to give to someone, especially for those first 30, 60 days after the disclosure. But there needs to be a lot of action quickly, and there needs to be an accessible resource to help guide that.
Yeah, definitely. What are some of the biggest challenges that both men and women who've have after a spouse has admitted to having an affair?
So this is speaking more to the person who's the victim of that.
Yeah.
So that's an experience that is not primarily covered in the book, but there's a profound need there too. I will say that often people in the church, they know what to do with the person who's coming clean, because there's so many of the core nuances of the gospel that speak directly to people who are coming clean after a major sin. The amazing grace. I was once blind, but now I see. I was lost. Now I'm found. There's a clear direction. I've sinned. Okay, well now we want to give you grace and want to help you find forgiveness. It's a little less obvious immediately if you carry that emphasis. What should be said and done for the person who's the sufferer, and the challenges are profound. Some people experience it as analogous to a major trauma. There are, we all know that when soldiers come back from war, when a car backfires, emotionally they feel like they're right back on the battlefield. And some people experience their spouse committing adultery as something that is a lot like that. So, walking by family pictures can be jarring, and they feel, oh no, that was when I was being lied to. That trip on that vacation I was being lied to. They hear things, even just as simple like, I love you, things are gonna be okay. Well, you said that to me while you were cheating on me too. And so there are tremendous amounts of reminders that are just very painful to work through. It's a very difficult experience to walk through, and it's just immense challenges, both emotionally and also practically, because a lot of people aren't sure, how do I know when the person's changed? How do I know if this marriage is salvageable? What do I do if I have kids in the picture? Just tremendous amounts of confusion, and it is a major life grief to walk through.
How do you begin to walk with somebody? They're, maybe a family member or a close friend or something like that. How would they walk with somebody that's going through an affair?
So again, the person who's actually in the affair?
Either one. I mean, the husband and the wife. How would somebody just walk with them?
Sure. So it's tough to be the person who walks with both of them.
Well, maybe it's a separate person. So maybe there's one for the husband and one for the wife, let's say.
Sure. So in this scenario, we're talking about the husband being the one who's strayed, and I often find that I see pastors and friends who do really good work in this kind of scenario. It's there are many people who are highly defensive after having had an affair. It's an incredibly embarrassing thing to come clean about. It's incredibly shameful, and so it's understandable why that defensiveness would arise. But I've often seen that friends, good friends who are walking with a brother in this season, can start to say, "Listen, I know that you're feeling a lot of complicated things right now, but I don't know that it's going to be helpful for you to criticize your wife so much. I know that there were systemic things happening. I know that there were hard things happening in the marriage, but I don't know that this is a profitable place for us to park." And I think friends can often, in more blunt ways than maybe a counselor would be able to, because the relationship's not always established as deeply. Friends sometimes have an easier time just saying, no, listen, we can't go this direction. And so that there's a healthy pushback to defensiveness or blame shifting. And then there's also just a hopefulness that a friend can provide, that you're not going to stay here. God's not done with you. Of course, we have all these examples in Scripture of King David and others who have fallen far. The Apostle Peter, and the Lord restores them. In this scenario, if the wife is needing someone to walk with, I think you're really going to need someone who has a lot of grace and patience and can hear over and over some of the griefs. Intense suffering is going to usually feel nonsensical. Like, where did this come from? How did this end up being dumped into my life? You haven't yet processed it as something that the Lord could be involved in or ministering to you in. Often it's just immediately it's at least the stark realities of just that my whole picture of my life has been destroyed. And so often a friend who can walk with, in this case, the woman who's been cheated on, is often going to need to be offering a ministry of presence Psalm 23, when we see someone who's walking in a valley of the shadow of death, and what the Lord provides is an assurance. Don't be afraid, I'm with you in this darkness. A friend, analogously, is going to provide that, not try to just fix the darkness or force you to light, but to walk you patiently through that dark experience, knowing there's no way to rush through that. In time, okay, yes, there's going to be a way to start to say, where is God in all of this? How will we get to the light together? But it's slow work.
So we have to be patient and prayerful and just really listening and just really slow to. Do you think that we need to be slow to say much? Or I know you mentioned just being there and kind of maybe helping them out of their mindset, their bad mindsets or whatever. But would you say that's pretty much what you're saying there?
So I'm a little bit more directive, I think, with the person who's had the affair. And again, not every affair is the same, and there's significant differences. But I find I have to do a little more guiding, because the sad reality is that you don't have an affair unless you've been pretty self-oriented for some time. And so then when you come clean, not all of that self-orientation, not all of that self-centeredness goes away right away. And so sometimes even the months following, even though you've been on your knees before the Lord confessing, trying to move away from it, sometimes you're still very self-centered in how you're talking, how the person's talking. I do find I have to be kind of a little bit more directive to guide the person who's had the affair, whereas the person who's been affected by the affair often does need a safe place to just struggle and be frustrated and be confused and at times be fighting for hope. I find I'm slow to criticize people who are in very great suffering. It's not something I'm eager to do. Not to say no one needs direction or guidance or help. It's just, people often say that, Job's 3 friends did the best counseling the first 7 days. Yeah,
I think what you said earlier about it being such a traumatic event, it just brought up like some, like in my childhood was very difficult, and, not to equate that as the same, but just to say like I had a lot of deep challenges and pain in my childhood that I had to get help with, and so same with my wife. Her parents tragically passed away, and so we can empathize when you put it in those kind of terms. I think that somebody could really empathize with somebody that's going through that experience, and just from an emotional perspective, because they've gone through traumatic things.
Yeah, that's 2 Corinthians 1, right? That even though my suffering and your suffering could be very different, if you've been through something hard and you know the grace that you were given, you could comfort me out of that affliction in whatever affliction I'm in.
Yeah.
There's a sense that even if the person's issue is very different from ours, there's something that God could have us to offer each other.
Yeah. So I've worked with men a lot and a lot of different things, areas, and I know that it's hard for them to apologize. I'm sure you know that as well. And it's something that men struggle with. So why is it so important to learn to apologize and confess our sin well to others?
Yeah, it's interesting that I hadn't framed it as a gender difference, but I suspect that culturally there's something to the cultural picture of masculinity that views failures and weaknesses as something to be strenuously resisted, right, and to not want to concede anything on. And apology certainly is that. It's a sense of weakness. It's a sense of admitting failure. The reason I spend so much time on it in the book is, for number one, there's no restoration with the Lord apart from repentance, which is a little bit more profound than an apology, but it's not less than that. There's no restoration of fellowship with the Lord apart from repentance. Our prayers are hindered. If we hide sin in our hearts, God is not close to the one who hides and protects and guards sins. And in the context of a marriage, it's absolutely vital to be able to offer a real apology, which is not, I would never have done this if you hadn't done that, or, for anything I might have done to hurt you, please forgive me. There are a lot of half apologies people give that do more damage than good.
Yeah.
But learning to apologize is mostly learning to understand the impact that your actions have had on another person and to name them plainly without defense. But of course, there are extenuating circumstances. Of course, there are pressures and systemic problems in marriages, always. But to be able to actually own the impact of your actions on another person is profoundly healing for the person who's been sinned against.
Here's what I tell men. One time I can't remember what exactly I was preaching on at a men's retreat, but I said, one thing that I've learned is that you have to, what your wife wants to hear, and I said, go ask your wife this later when you get home. But ask her, do you want me, sweetheart, to apologize to you specifically? And what your Christian wife will always say to you, you guys can go listen to that. When you who are listening to this can ask your wife, do you want me to apologize to you specifically? And she will always say yes. And why? Because she wants you to know that you understand what you did was wrong and why you did it and what you're going to do about it.
Sure.
So if I have a fight with my wife and I say something stupid, what she wants me to do, just using an example, which, I mean, we all know that it's a real example too, okay? What she wants to hear is not just, okay, well, I'm sorry for such and such thing that I said, but why did you say it? Well, we were talking about something and such and such thing came out, or, such and such thing happened, just using a generic example. I'm really sorry for saying what I did. The words that I used, the way that I said it was wrong. I'm sincerely sorry. Would you please forgive me? God, the Lord is working on me in this area, or something to that like effects, like specifically owning it, specifically apologizing for it, specifically saying this is where God's working on me. And, the one thing that I would say is it takes a while for a wife to respond well to that. Like she has to learn to, like my wife had to learn to respond to that well. So we had to work through that. I mean, these aren't things, these are long-term things that take time. And I'm not saying like this isn't like a one-time Band-Aid kind of thing. This is like, this is like a long-term like marriage health thing that'll not just for
what you're saying is absolutely vital, because what often happens is person builds toward that climactic apology and they feel like, okay, I came clean now, don't bring it up again, right? Now don't, I apologize. What more do you want? The reality is, in this kind of situation, I appreciate how you said it was a process. That you offer that. It is important to offer that initial apology the best you can. Right? You just apologize for what you know and what you're aware of. But then it's kind of your job over time to understand more about it, so that you can apologize more effectively and own it more effectively. This is one of those times where the kind of the forgive, forget, don't bring it up again isn't really all that helpful. Because the reality is, this is a major grief. This is a major offense. And the reality is, for the person moving back to the Lord, returning from the affair, over those next few months, there's going to be a lot of new insight and awareness. And then over years, there's going to be more insight and awareness. And so I think it's entirely appropriate for the issue to be brought up, again, for greater healing. Not against the person, but for the relationship. I'm sorry, this is still very hard for me, to say, for example, or the person confessing says, when I used to say this kind of stuff to you after the affair, and I realized now that it was still the mindset of the affair talking. It was still me in that old mindset. And I never realized that what pressure I put on you when you had to be with the kids while we were separated. Now I get it more. These things are healing in an ongoing way. The more insight you have, the more you can speak honestly. And I think there are a lot of people say, well, we've had so much healing, things are so much better now, I don't want to bring it up again and upset my spouse by bringing it up again. And I often find that quite the opposite is the case, that when the spouse who's done the offense brings it up again, they're only accessing the thing that the other spouse has to live with all the time, and they're not typically putting it in their minds and making life worse. They're actually they're living in reality with their spouse.
I could see that happening with a guy that, even with guys that struggle with pornography, for example, or something like that. They often want to hide their sin, and then they tell their wife, and their wife's devastated, and they have to work through that. So so we've talked a lot about that, but and those are very important things. How can those who've had an affair begin to build their testimony again?
You mean like reputation?
Yeah, reputation.
Yeah. So the testimony in this way is a bit of a it's a complex issue because it right where good names rather to be chosen than great riches, right? In Proverbs, there's something to respectability being gained, but you learning not to cling to that as you seek restoration is going to be important. Clinging to the reputation, it's not going to be all that helpful. Now that I'm talking though, I think that you're probably referring to the chapter title that says "Building a Testimony," which is actually writing out kind of more of a story of grace. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. But you can go the way that you're going with it is good too. Yeah.
Yes. So I have complex feelings about the idea of a testimony or keeping your testimony, keeping your reputation, because in many contexts that I grew up in, it was something that actually prevented people from seeking help and led to a lot of covering over of sins in unhelpful ways.
Yeah.
So I don't have a whole lot of sympathy with the idea of really working hard to make sure your reputation's better, because I think that in this case, it's you set off a bomb in your house and making the house look like there's nothing wrong is not that great of an idea. Certainly rebuild the house, right? But don't try to pretend that nothing's wrong with it.
I think we've talked about a lot of that too: repenting of sin, being honest, being accountable, having people walk alongside of you, and so I think that covers. Yes. We'll just say that covers that. Yes. We'll leave it at that. And I agree with you. It definitely that definitely can be used. That language can be used to kind of just kind of excuse your life or whatever. So moving on to the next question. What are some essential qualities and habits for the long haul for those who have had an affair?
I would say humility, kindness, and persistent honesty, and I'll mostly focus on first and the third. So humility, there's a lot of sense, there can be a lot of pressure to kind of rebuild your sense of pride and your sense of dignity as a person because you feel like it was all destroyed by the affair. So it's essential that we not do that by bringing another person down or settling scores, all things that some people can be particularly tempted to do in the wake of an affair. Over the long haul, honesty is perhaps the single greatest need, because I think many people who have had an affair are surprised to find out that what their spouse is most grieved by is not what happened sexually, but the deception. That's the thing that many spouses will say, I cannot live with. I cannot live with deception. I can forgive everything else. Or I can handle even you struggling and being tempted sexually, but I need you to be honest with me. And I've heard that so many times and I think it makes sense. You have to know what you're working with. And if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's very hard to rebuild the marriage. So I think there's hardly anything I can think of that's more important for the long haul than that.
Yeah, that's really good. So we have lots of pastors and ministry leaders who listen to this podcast, and since we're talking about biblical counseling this month, how can we help them? How can they themselves walk with and equip church members to walk with those who've had an affair?
So how would pastors equip their members to do this? Even for pastors to think those questions is really encouraging for me. So my guess is that even if they're simply asking that question, how can I help my people be ready for something like this when it happens? You'd be a few steps ahead of the game, just because this is a thing that surprises us. It's very common to be very shocked by the people who fall into an affair, and the reason for it is that honestly that we're all vulnerable. There's no one of us who is, by virtue of who we are, perfectly safe from this kind of sin. So it lends toward it being something that it feels like it can sneak up on us. But I think cultivating the kind of environment in the church where you can talk about struggle, you can talk about challenges in marriages, that there are people who are raised up, discipled to walk with others who are suffering. That's gonna cover a lot. I think there are different ways to do this. I would start with the leadership training, the small group leader training, or essentially who are your people who are involved, kind of looking at the people who are your primary ministers in the church, and start thinking about their training from a standpoint of care. So how can I equip these specific people who the Lord has put under my guidance as leaders? How can I equip them to walk with those who are suffering? That's a way I would start, because often not handling suffering well is one of the things that leads to sexual sin. So I think if you start there, you're probably going to support people in ways that they end up looking in the wrong places for later.
That's well said. So Michael, there's a lot that we haven't talked about this book and just about this topic in general. But just as we wrap it up, can you give us a few takeaways that you have, or maybe more than a few if you'd like?
Sure. Yeah, I think adultery is an issue that I think it usually feels like the death of a marriage. It feels like everything's been lost at that point. We all grieve it. We all feel it heavy, in a very heavy way when people who are in our friend network or family fall in this way. But the silver lining is that in Christ, the things that die can be resurrected. And there's one author who says that infidelity is the disorder that can lead to a new order. And there are times when an affair, emotional affair, physical affair, when a person turns away from it, it can lead to a profound awareness of, oh my goodness, where did we go wrong? Where did I go wrong? And it's never something that you would ever wish on your worst enemy, but there are ways that it can be a huge wake-up call. And it's like a broken bone. When it sets again, it can be stronger. You never want to break a bone, but every time it rains or is cold again, you're going to feel it. So there are lasting effects, but we do serve a God who can redeem and who saves to the uttermost. So we walk a fine line because we want to create a place in the church where we are people who believe in miracles and we have this immense hope. But at the same time, we want to be able to walk with people who are suffering and not force the narrative of restoration on the person whose spouse, for example, is continuing to persist in sin, and it does not look like reconciliation is happening. The victim in that situation has not failed, and they don't have a subpar narrative in a sense. They don't have a subpar testimony before the Lord. So we as the church have to walk a very fine line, right? We hold out immense hope of the gospel, and we also walk with people through things that are very broken, and we don't know if this side of heaven will see the full restoration.
Yeah, it's really well said. Well, really well said. Well, Michael, this has been a very, how do you say this? Interesting conversation. Can't use the word. It's been, in some ways, it's been good though, because I think that it's helpful to understand, as you've talked about it, walking with people in honesty. I think that just gives people a warning about the seriousness of indwelling sin and the need to be, open and accountable and real about what you're going through. I think that's good. But I think also you provide a lot of help for people that know people that have had this, an affair, or maybe they're listening and they're going through this right now. So I really appreciate the thoughtful answers that you've given, brother.
Well, thanks for the chance to talk.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you were encouraged by today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. For more uplifting and thought-provoking content, please visit us online at servantsofgrace.org. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Servants of Grace, and on Facebook at facebook.com/servantsofgrace. We hope you have a blessed day, and we will see you next time.